Hi, I'm Sonam Srivastava, Director Brand Management at Seagull Advertising. Today we are going to talk about a little about communication, something that we all do daily, but do we really understand it? For many, communication is about an email sent, a message replied to, or a post commented on. But is it really successful? Is it something that is really influencing a decision making process? Is it something that is really helping change a behavior? Or is it something that is really bringing about a measurable change in an organization? Is it really doing that? Communication is not just that, it is much, much deeper than what we all assume it to be or what we all understand it to be. It is actually something that should bring a strategic shift in the mind of the receiver. And to dig deeper into this conversation, I have with me a communication specialist, a strategist, and a thought leader straight from the land of fire and ice, Iceland. I have with me Mr. Mike Klein, who is an MBA from the prestigious London Business School. He also is an owner of a global initiative, We Lead Comms, and he as well is a principal consultant at Changing the Terms. He's right now on a 6-week long journey, which is an enriching and an insightful journey in India about the communication practitioners and communication in an organizational level. So Mike, I welcome you. A warm namaste. Welcome to India, welcome to Seagull, and welcome to Pune.
Thank you very much.
So Mike, can we start by understanding your journey? How did you pick up this niche of internal communication and your entire journey into communications?
Well, it's been a long journey. It's taken a few detours, a few forks. And one of the things about good storytelling that I've been told is that you start in the middle. So really the time when this kind of shifted was when I went to business school. For the first 10 years of my career, I managed political campaigns throughout the United States. I've worked for candidates of both major parties. I've worked in state level elections. And I know you've got very competitive state level elections here in India.
Yes.
So I did most of my work at that level. And I kind of had accomplished everything that I'd sought to accomplish at that level. I mean, without, deciding to spend the rest of my career, which would have probably put me in an early grave because of the stress levels. So at a certain point back in the 90s, I decided to go to business school. And I got into London Business School. I decided to go there and didn't really know what I was going to do next when I got to business school. And then I was sitting in the Career Center and I saw this brochure from a firm called Smythe Dorward Lambert, which at the time was a company that was trying to establish itself as the premier internal communication firm and to establish internal communication as a strategic management discipline.
Okay.
And we're looking basically 30 years later, and we're still trying to establish internal communication as a strategic management discipline. And that's one of the reasons why I've come to India, because we're looking at a convergence of trends that has the potential to finally move us over that cliff, or move us over that gap, rather. But what drove me into internal communication was the fact that internal communication isn't just simply telling people to do stuff and then it magically gets done, which is a lot of what C-suite folks, particularly, and a lot of the people who are in C-suites, they're trained in very linear ways. They're trained as accountants. They're trained as engineers. They're trained that if A plus B equals C, then D, E, and F follow. And the reality is A plus B may equal C, but getting to F is a much more intricate and interactive process. And internal communication is really at the core of this process. The challenge is whether you can get organizations to do it consciously enough and well enough to actually get to F versus focusing on a bunch of other things that are nice and make people feel good, but don't necessarily move business performance.
Right. Great. So Mike, just for our listeners as well. What is communication?
What is communication? You know, it's interesting that you asked the question, because I think the answer is not particularly relevant in the grand scheme of things. Communication is, you know, pretty much anything where two or more bodies, they don't have to be humans, you know, birds communicate, pigs communicate. You can even argue that plants at a certain level communicate. It's not intrinsically a human process. There's a certain amount of signaling that takes place between, you know, these creatures, either to avoid harm or to find food or whatever. And communication in and of itself doesn't interest me a lot. What interests me is the extent to which communication can move people, the extent to which communication can allow people to respond, to interact, the extent to which communication can catalyze and move and drive things. But it's not the communication that does it. It's the people that do it. It's the organizations that do it. And there's also a lot of focus in our space on psychology, on the individuals. But there's a real underrated focus on the groups, the tribes, the communities, the things that we identify with, and the extent to which those identities drive behavior as well. And that's kind of where I come from. I mean, in internal communication, it's not just the boss saying, do this, and it magically gets done. It's the boss saying, do this, and it's the employee trying to figure out, what is it that he's asked me to do? Why should I do this? Why is this more important than doing something that the other three bosses have told me to do? Yeah. And internal communication, when done well, can reduce this ambiguity and allow organizations and individuals to perform. It's just, by and large, it hasn't really been used for that purpose to a large extent.
True. So, Mike, we at Seagull believe that every business can fly, and we do that through ideas that soar. How do you think internal or organizational communication can help businesses fly?
Well, I think in terms of flying, we're really at a point where you fly or you die right now. We've got three massive trends that are hitting business are going to hit business really hard in the next 6 to 36 months. One of the reasons why I came to India is because it's hitting India harder and faster than it is anywhere else, which means that a lot of the things that will be decisive will be figured out here before they're figured out anywhere else. But also, and that's really both what can we learn from India, but also what are the stakes. You know, and those trends are AI automating and accelerating work. Right now, there's a whole bunch of talk about the automation of work and how it's going to, reduce numbers of white-collar workers around the world. And there's no question that that's already happening. You've got, Nestle's just gotten rid of 15,000, Amazon's gotten rid of 30,000, and the numbers just keep rolling in. So, this is live, this is real, this is not the future, this is what's happening now.
Right now,
But there's also going to be an acceleration of work that AI is going to drive as well, and that's also starting to happen.
Right.
And already, particularly in the communication field, there's been a lot of chat, particularly in UK and US communication circles, about burnout, about people being tired, about people being tired of change, people not wanting to hear about this latest trend that's going to knock them on their tails. But the reality is this is happening now, and it's accelerating. And what happens in India could well be decisive for what happens in the rest of the world. And at the same time, there's also, and the good news is that the people who I'm talking with in India get this to a far higher extent than the people who I'm talking to elsewhere.
Right.
Because the people I'm talking to elsewhere are saying, yeah, we've seen this before. Yeah, it's another change in technology. At the end of the day, we'll just keep doing what we're doing, and we'll be fine. And I don't see any evidence that that's going to be the case. But at least here, people are willing to entertain the conversation.
Right.
And this is where internal communication and branding can come in together very nicely.
True.
Because branding is all about the promises, the principles, and practices of the brand. And if you've got AI automating white-collar work, it will automate it to the extent to which a human does not need to be involved. When that human needs to be involved, that human's going to be involved to make a decision. And if that brand architecture, if those principles, practices, values, non-negotiables are not self-evident to that person making that decision, that decision will either be made badly or it'll be escalated upwards, which will eliminate all of the acceleration advantages that you've created with the AI.
Yeah.
So this is kind of where the inquiry is. I mean, if we can get this figured out, the benefits for communication professionals across disciplines, whether it's internal communication, branding, external communication, what have you, on the other side of all of this is the role of communication moving from being a secondary support function to being the critical function in organizations.
Right. So help me with some clarity, Mike.
Sure.
As I understand, internal communication is a lot more humane, is a lot more connected with your workforce, and it is much more than just the productivity of the workforce. How is AI going to help that? I mean, wouldn't that take away the humane aspect out of it?
Well, I think there's a lot of stuff in the space that has been very performative on the humanity, their humanness side. A lot of it shows up as, talking about why the organization is more humane than it actually is. To a certain extent, there, you look at the say-do gaps between what organizations say they are and how they react, and particularly what they do in times of crisis, which we are in the eye of a time of crisis right now. And that a lot of what's been done in internal communication, particularly on the HR-oriented side of it, has been to try to make people feel as comfortable as possible with effectively the dysfunctionality of their organizations.
Right.
And I don't think an internal communication that helps people define and decide to operate in a compatible way with brand principles and with customer pressures. I don't think there's anything that's not humane about it. I think if anything, it's much more humane because it reduces that ambiguity. A lot of what's been going on in internal comms is to try to make people comfortable with that that ambiguity and that inconsistency.
Yeah.
But that ambiguity and inconsistency is going to be a lot harder to defend going forward. And also the bargain is a lot different. I mean, a lot of what's been done in internal communication, and particularly in the world of employee engagement, has been designed to drive long-term loyalty or, push a bargain of security in return for loyalty. That security goes out the window. Now, when that security goes out the window, are you still going to try to push loyalty to that extent? I would hope not, because it would just simply destroy what's left of your credibility.
Right.
So at some point, the fundamental conversation about what internal comms is there to do, and perhaps where internal comms is owned, is going to have to shift rapidly to accommodate this new reality.
Interesting. So today, I am not sure if there is any particular designation that takes care of organizational or internal communication in a company. Do you think AI agents can help do that?
Well, I mean, there are, in terms of internal communication, it has a whole bunch of different guises.
Right.
It can be, a standalone function. It can be a standalone function that reports to a CEO or a CEO office. That's rare, but it happens. It can report to marketing. It can report to HR. It's, I argue that there should be somebody with dedicated responsibility in any organization larger than, say, 200 people, where you can't guarantee that everybody knows each other, or where you're operating out of multiple locations. Because if you're not doing that, then stuff is going to get missed. Where AI can come into the execution of internal communication is that it simplifies the execution of anything that can be digitized.
Right.
So AI agents are not going to orchestrate a launch event for you, but they may orchestrate all of the audio, visual, the messaging, the content. You might even get a hologram of the speak. You might be able to automate the whole, the whole theatric of it. But at the end of the day, you're going to need people to make sure that the microphone turns on and that the seats are arranged properly. And you're going to have AI communicating with AI. You're going to have people produce, AI is going to produce or edit content that will then end up being filtered through an AI filter that an individual will end up getting a 20-page document ends up as 6 bullet points. There's going to be a lot of that. But internal communication needs, if organizations are going to be able to align in a common direction towards common priorities, people need to know what those are, and they need to have some idea of what that means, and they need to have some ability to participate in the process of moving there. I was doing some research with a company called Lumas, which is a global leader in the internal comms platform space. And, we were looking at the extent to which people were interacting with technology, the extent to which technology was an issue in the way people communicated. And there's a huge problem in a lot of companies, which is like, if you want to do day-to-day work in a company, you've got your intranet, you've got your HR platform, you've got your search platform, you're opening up 20 different windows before you even start the day. And none of these systems talk to each other. And so an employee who's being tasked to do all of this stuff can't even pull all of this stuff together in a coherent way. That's something that's going to, and obviously, there's a huge opportunity for, employee communication platforms to integrate a lot of that stuff.
Right.
But ultimately, and the other thing was that in the research, we found that the biggest issue that employees and leaders thought in an organization is the level of interactivity in the organization.
Right.
The extent to which the organization listens to and responds to employee feedback. Because employees are the ones who understand how they get their job done and how the customers interact with them.
Right.
That's not happening at the C-suite.
True.
You could have a CEO spend a day in a store to get an idea of what it's like, but they don't get the idea in the same way that somebody who works on that cash register does. 8 hours a day, 6 days a week does.
True. So this, I guess, is a 5X era, right? The thing that's going on.
The 5X era, that was what Jim O'Leary described it at the ICCO conference that I attended in Mumbai last week. Excellent presentation, by the way.
Great.
And he was talking about 5 different economies. And I think I can remember 3 of them, but let me give it a go. So you've got the attention economy, you've got the creator economy, you've got the experience economy, and there's 2 other economies, all of which are operating in parallel.
Right.
And all of which have communication, particularly strategic communication, at the heart and as a kind of decisive factor in each.
Right.
And that's something that should make people feel bullish about the future of this industry, is that the more work that gets automated, the more production work, the more commodity work, the more difficult, fiddly execution stuff, the more that gets automated, the more central those of us who are strategic become.
Right.
Because if you look at a product or service and 95% of it's going to be automated,
Correct.
the differentiator is going to be the story. The differentiator is going to be the service.
Yeah.
And what's in the back of both of those things is strategic communication.
True.
I see communication moving from being, as I said before, a second-tier support function to being the core organizational function, perhaps within the next 3 years.
So with these Gen Zs and now even Gen Alphas getting into the workforce, what is that one tip or what should be the strategic communication approach that the leaders should now take? Because we all know Gen Zs and Gen Alphas, they operate differently. They communicate differently. Their vocabulary is very different. So what would be that one strategic approach that you would recommend organizations to have engagement, to have better communication within the workforce?
Well, let me take a step back from the question. Because when you're talking about the entry of Gen Zs and Gen Alphas into the workforce, this is taking place at a time when a lot of people currently in the workforce are being churned.
True.
And, in the West, we're hearing, we're just not going to have entry-level hiring for a few years.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think the first strategic decision to make is not to end entry-level hiring. It's how do you optimize entry-level hiring and how do you hire the right Gen Zs and Gen Alphas for the future of communication, particularly if you're talking about this industry.
Yeah.
The idea of having an internship in a big American public relations firm working in the fancy office making coffee for the folks, that's pretty much done. I think the entry-level hiring will probably, particularly in the comms field, will need to focus on people who've already been building in this space. Influencers, people who've been, people who've created their own channels, people who've created their own platforms, people who are really good at connecting other people.
Right.
Those are, and those haven't been the skills that have been hiring skills in this profession up to this point. We need people with those skills to come in and quickly, reverse mentor and reverse catalyze the people who will stay in, from the earlier generations. And also to kind of change the tempo of the whole operation. You need that. Organizations that are just going to say, we're not going to hire anybody for the next 5 years are organizations that are going to set themselves on a course for obsolescence probably a lot sooner than that. Mm-hmm. So the most strategic decision to make about communicating with Gen Zs and Alphas is to hire them so you can start communicating with them. The second thing is that the thing that makes AI different from a lot of these other transformations at the moment is right now nobody is AI native. And you can argue that people from my generation, I'm at the top end of Generation X, people who are in Generation X and millennials have been through several of these technology changes before and have seen how the dynamic works. Now, this is going to be bigger and it's going to be more systemic, but we have had experience in working to get organizations through that transition. So getting rid of all of your 40 and ups is also not a smart strategy. It's getting the 20s to work with the 40s and to cross-fertilize each other as efficiently and effectively as quickly as possible. That's going to be, I think, the survival to success opportunity that presents itself at the moment.
So there's this concept globally called less is more. Does that work for internal communication as well?
Yes, 100%. And a lot of people in the internal comms world do not like when I say this. Doing more with less. So? It's like, no, I want to do more with more. I want my budget. I want my team. I don't want to have to do this. I don't want to have to keep doing it.
Yeah.
The reality is that organizations have too much noise. One of the downsides of AI is it becomes a lot easier to self-publish in an organization, to self-publish, to self-distribute, to self-generate content. That's bad news for communication people, because a lot of people can say, we don't need you to do this. I'm just going to ask ChatGPT to do it. And you lose that. Not only do you lose the quality of the content, because it's not that ChatGPT automatically produces bad content, but people who don't know what they're doing from a communication perspective will prompt ChatGPT in very simplistic and ineffective ways that will end up irritating large numbers of people when they're exposed to that content. There's also the issue of internal distribution, who's got access to which people in the organization, and how regularly they can bypass a central communication function. Like, you've got like big change programs in organizations.
Okay.
And they set their own KPIs, and a lot of them say inform all stakeholders. And so they're not necessarily that interested in going through a strategic communication evaluation process. They want to send their email to everybody so they can tick that box and move on with their Gantt chart.
Job is done. Yeah.
Exactly. So that there is a downside from an AI perspective of that. And so doing more with less is about actually restraining a lot of, and reducing a lot of the low value, high volume communication activities that consume a lot of time and bandwidth and energy, and that keep us from doing stuff that makes a difference. So I'm all about doing more with less. And there's a particular theme in my career around identifying, connecting, and mobilizing internal influencers. Over the years, there's been a body of research in an area called organizational network analysis. And the research in that field has continually said that, about 3 to 5% of people in an organization drive 90% of the conversations. And one of the things that organizations need to start doing, and practitioners and professionals need to start doing, is to push to get this done. Because those people who are driving these conversations, these internal influencers, they're the people who are talking at what you would call the chai sutta. These are the people who are talking on WhatsApp. These are the people who are talking in the Zoom chat rooms. These are the people who are consuming, filtering, and distributing your internal content. I was having a conversation earlier today where people were saying, 20% adoption of an intranet is terrible. We have to get it higher. And it's like, well, who are the 20%? 20% of the people following your intranet may be an absolute goldmine if it's the right 20%. Because if it's the right 20%, then they're taking the information from the intranet, and then they're distributing it through their conversations. And they're reducing the amount of noise and bandwidth that the rest of the organization has to consume to get the same information out. And, doing an organizational network analysis, identifying your internal influencers is absolutely key, not only to doing more with less, but to do more with less noise. And with more power.
Right. So who in an organization would really qualify to be an internal influencer?
Anybody goes to for news, information, moral support, professional advice, or increasingly support with learning about AI. And if you ask people in the organization who these people are, then you put together that list of your 3 to 5%, and then you can streamline all of your communication, because these people, these 3 to 5%, they have an appetite for the detail. They have an appetite for understanding what's important, because it's important to them to be for their own credibility, their own centrality in the organization. So they have a reason to want to read your intranet in the same way that your customer service rep, who's more interested in getting home and taking care of their kids, is not going to have an interest in.
Correct. Yeah. Somebody who's really vested in the company, somebody who really understands the pulse of the company.
or somebody who's really vested in being skeptical about the company. Sometimes your best internal influencers are your skeptics.
The ones with a black hat.
The ones with the black hat, because your skeptics, when informed, are much more reliable communicators than when they're uninformed. There's a reason why they're internal influencers. They're internal influencers because they connect the dots that are unconnected by the official communication.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're really good at pulling together information. Sometimes they're really good at making stuff up. Sometimes they're really good at conspiracy theory. Sometimes they're really good at entertaining people. And most organizations think, oh, we need to drive all of our communication through the managers. And so they over-inform the managers.
Yeah.
The managers, in turn, are trying to protect their own positions. So they want to emphasize those things which align with their agenda. And, so you have like briefing packs, these PowerPoint presentations that, this is your cascade and you need to cascade that. And, you've got 25 slides. Well, guess what? They cascade 20, they cascade 15. And slide number 14, they use air quotes to say, we really care about diversity in our organization. You're giving them a lot more power to interfere with your messaging if you're not doing it in parallel with your influencers.
So they're essentially your critiques.
Well, your skeptics are your critics, but when turned, they can be your biggest advocates.
Biggest asset, yeah. True.
And even if you don't turn them, they can be your best feedback channel because they're willing to tell you honestly what most of your employees aren't willing to say.
Some time back when we were conversing, Mike, you mentioned about a lot of what internal communication should achieve depends on the brief that you get.
100%.
Brief is also something very, very pertinent in our industry. What is it that, is an ideal internal communications brief laden with numbers or with, specific measurable goals? Or what is a brief or a good brief for internal communication?
There haven't been a lot of really good briefs for internal communication, and that's part of the issue. That many organizations, particularly at relatively low levels of maturity, say, I want a newsletter, I want a poster, I want to, or maybe I want to increase employee engagement scores by 5 points. A lot of the briefs don't connect with, particularly when the briefs are coming from client side. Now, a smart internal comms person, when met with a need, will go and initiate the brief, will challenge the need. Do you need a poster, or do you need to achieve 5% increase in sales in the next 3 months, and make sure that whatever you were going to put on that poster was actually operationalized and not just simply distributed. Now, the brief is only part of it.
Right.
The ability to connect a communication activity with specific measurable outcomes in the business. That's the ball game. That's the power. That's that's where the ability of the communication function to move from a second tier support function to being a core strategic function. That's part of that process. And there's a lot of room for basic models, basic tools that could dramatically impact this. Like, how to build a business case. You build a business case by saying, okay, here's a problem. What's the value of that problem? How much is that problem worth to you, Mr. C-suite officer? If they can't give you a dollar value or a rupee value for that problem, then you have to ask, is that really a problem that's worth my attention? If they can put a dollar value on the problem or the rupee value on the problem, you say, okay, it's a $100 million problem. That's a big problem. The second bit is how much communication can actually impact that. It's something that I call the comms factor. And this is the point where you can actually credibly start to build a business case that you can defend. So say, for instance, the business leader says, I have $100 million problem. Most comms people, when they try to build business models, say, I can solve that for you and try to claim the whole $100 million. That blows your credibility apart. And that kind of moves you back into second tier support function conversations. But, pretty much any business problem that involves human behavior, you can make a credible baseline assumption that improving communication can fix at least 5% of the problem. Now, if you can model and, create a body of evidence to say, no, it's more like 10 or 20 based on previous experience, great. But if you're really just starting with that 5% and you've got a $100 million problem, that's $5 million on the bottom line. Most communication functions, even the most luxurious functions in the biggest companies, aren't anywhere near that level of funding. So literally, you can justify 1 times 10 times your salary from your contribution to one project. If you're able to apply this methodology. I teach this methodology. It's literally something you can learn in a half hour.
Correct.
Also, how do you track the impact of your work? Well, it's not just clicks and likes. Clicks and likes track clicks and likes. They don't track impact.
Yeah.
But if you're communicating about, a behavior change, like, we're going to give our frontline employees the ability to refund refund up to $100 to their customers without having to escalate. You can track how many refunds get given out, which illustrates the extent to which people understand the policy. You can also track the extent to which those $100 refunds are reducing your customer churn. So you get those two numbers. Yeah. And you've demonstrated in dollar terms and in impact terms what you've done with your communication as opposed to just clicks and likes. Yeah. Now, there's another issue is how do you get the business to give you that data? Or how do you create data that approximates the data that the business won't give you? Because that's also key. I mean, you can't measure the impact of your work on the business unless you can actually track what's going on in that impact zone.
Yeah.
But at least if we can get into the conversation, we can make much better requests of our stakeholders to give us the data that allows us to demonstrate our value.
So you were recently at the ICCO summit in Mumbai.
Yes.
Tell us something about that.
It was a fantastic event. Amit Prabhu was really one of the senior leaders of the communication world here. Put on an absolutely superb event. He's got a great team. And there were a few things that really stood out. Yes, there were presentations from some of the world's top agency folks. And as an internal comms person, I often don't have a lot of visibility of what's going on at the agency level. I had to put on my hat as editor-in-chief of Strategic Magazine, which is a thought leadership platform for the communication profession as a whole, which got me the invite to attend in the first place. To really look at how people are seeing the future of the industry from a future of agencies perspective. And they're looking at it at probably a 40,000-foot level while I'm looking at it at about 10,000-foot level. Yeah. And so they're looking at reputation, they're looking at sustainability, geopolitics. All of this stuff is critical context for what I'm talking about. It's not mutually exclusive.
True.
But you have... it was an immensely strategic conversation, which was great. The thing that impressed me the most was the seriousness, the confidence, and the momentum being projected by the Indian communication leaders in that room. And this is a theme that's really come out throughout my trip. I've only been here for a week, but this is a theme that's come out thunderously, which is that India has, particularly in the communication space, India has not only reached parity with the rest of the world, it's preparing to leapfrog.
Yeah. In one of your videos, I guess a takeaway video from perhaps day 1 or day 2 of the summit, you mentioned that Indian communicators can communicate pride and modesty simultaneously.
Correct.
What does that mean?
That there is an inner confidence. that really shows up with a lot of communication people that I've met here. An inner confidence to say, you know, yes, I acknowledge with modesty the accomplishment, but you know damn well that that person is proud as hell of it. Mm. And they don't have to say it. It just shines. And in a field where you've got so many people who are so defensive so much of the time, particularly in the internal council, particularly, you know, on both sides of the Atlantic, to see that was really inspiring. Oh. In general, I see a sense of confidence, optimism, and strategic understanding among communication professionals here that is next level compared to what I've seen elsewhere.
Wow. Okay. There's also a concept, Mike, which is the strategic silence. Does that play a role in internal communication? Is it relevant to internal communication as well?
It has I think it's understandable, but it's also one of the more toxic trends that we're dealing with. And it's particularly prevalent the further north and the further west you go. Organizations, when confronted with political instability, economic instability, you know, the inability to project confidence about the future, default to saying nothing, default to paralysis, default, you know, it's not just strategic silence, it's strategic inaction. Yeah. It's, you know, it's, and it's not, it's a conscious paralysis. Now, there's reasons why it makes sense in certain cases, because, you know, you can make a rational business decision that whatever you say about something is going to be wrong. Right. But there's also, you know, trying to have your cake and eat it too type of thing where, you know, you think if you can be silent, you can keep 100% of your customers. The downside is if you're trying to keep 100% of your customers and you're not satisfying anybody, you'll reach 0% of your customers fairly quickly. Most organizations don't have more than 50% market share. Many organizations don't have more than 10% market share. So in a polarized environment, there's actually some gain to be had by taking a stand, by being bold, by being willing to alienate people who aren't your customers, to get the loyalty of those who are, to increase your market share. I mean, there was back in 2016 when Donald Trump got elected the first time, and, you know, the level of opposition to him wasn't as high as it was there, but it was somewhat high. And there was a kind of this group called the Resistance. And there was this brand of cola, this national brand of cola called RC Cola, which maybe got 2% market share. And I was thinking, why don't they just rebrand as Resistance Cola? They tripled their market share in an instant. Yeah, true. And they didn't do it. And you don't see RC Cola pretty much anywhere in the United States right now. Yeah.
So is strategic silence, does it mean hiding something from people? Or, I mean, can we say that?
Silence can have many manifestations. And it can have many implications. When you're silent, you're saying nothing. So some people think no news is good news. Some people think no news is bad news. Other people think no news is no news. And so if you're hiding something, your inclination is going to be silent. If you don't have anything to say, sometimes your inclination is going to be silent. The downside of silence is eventually somebody else tells your story. You know, this is where internal influence comes in, where if there's no story going on about what's going on in the company, these people will make it up to try, you know, they will try to connect the few bits of information they are receiving and create a coherent story, which may or may not be true or may not even be malicious. But in the absence of a narrative, and particularly in the absence of an official story, unofficial stories proliferate. Yeah. So strategic silence is seen as a risk, as a low risk strategy. It's often an extremely high risk strategy.
Okay. So
And I'm
you-
not saying it's automatically inappropriate,
yeah.
but it's, you know, it's as much of a choice as being strategically loud.
And perhaps if it's not handled well, it can always be risky.
100%.
Right. You mentioned these Indian practitioners are actually kind of taking a leapfrog, and it is about, you know, taking that leap which could be ahead of a lot of global leaders around the globe. While they are operating in this vast cultural land, which is India, with an extremely ambitious and an extremely aspirational population, what is that one lesson that you think that the global leaders can take from Indian practitioners?
I think there are two really good lessons to take from Indian practitioners. One is that there is always momentum to be gained. There, you can always create momentum. And Indian practitioners are really good with momentum. The second is Indian practitioners are really good with scale. Nobody does scale like India. It's like when I was having a meeting and somebody was talking about a small company and I asked, how big is a small company? He said, 1,500. I live in Iceland. 1,500 gets you top 10 status in the country. You know, people were routinely talking about companies, 10,000, 30,000, 50,000 employees as being relatively small to medium-sized companies. India gets scale on a scale that people in the West can't even imagine. And that's not just simply the scale of distribution. It's not just simply, you know, the scale of engagement. It's also the scale of vision. You know, it's easy to think big in a place like this. It's easy to think ambitiously and aspirationally. You know, because, you know, even though, you know, material conditions might not be as comfortable as they are in the West, I think people are much more optimistic than people are in the West. Everybody in the West right now is trying to hold on by their fingertips between Trump, between, you know, all of the political trends in the West. Everybody's trying to hold on to what they have. And here you don't see that. And the default position is not that. And this is also where strategic silence comes in. Strategic silence makes sense if you're trying to defend yourself and protect yourself. It's not a position to take if you're growing, if you're ambitious, if you're optimistic, and you've got a destination that you're heading toward. And India gets that to a degree that folks in the West, you know, are really struggling with that at the moment.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned, Mike, that currently perhaps internal communication is more of a secondary function, but you foresee it to becoming a core function very, very soon, and that will be very strategically important for companies to have. And you look at internal communications, I believe, very, very differently. You also kind of challenge the traditional way of communication. Is it correct if I call you a humanist strategic data scientist?
It's one of the nicest things that anyone's ever called me.
I'm glad. No, but I mean, that's what you are actually coming across. You're not a data scientist, you're a humanist data scientist.
Well, thank you for describing me as that, because I've always had an affinity for communication data. My background is political campaigns. My background is survey research. My background is tracking the numbers. And to a large extent, the numbers that we've had available to ourselves in this profession have been crap. Employee engagement scores, crap. Clicks and likes, crap. I'm hungry for business data. I'm hungry for data that demonstrates the connection between the work that we do and the impact that we have. And I'm keen to help people. You know, if you're not going to get that data from the business, there are ways to create it yourselves. I mean, would I call myself a data scientist? Probably more of a data mad scientist. But, you know, there's, you know, the data sign is key, you know, and it's key because it can connect us to the power that we have. And once we look at the power that we have relative to the resources we consume, our conversations about budget and resource will go out the window. I mean, the sad, sick irony of all of the struggle that we've had in communication in general and internal communication in particular is the amount of money that it costs to have a really highly functioning internal comms function that actually adds, not just covers its salary, but it covers millions, covers massive, reduces organizational friction, increases productivity, increases credibility.
Yeah.
We're talking about the bar tab at Davos for some of these organizations.
Right.
We're talking minuscule expenditures. It's just we've become so paralyzed in our ability to create a business case for ourselves with numbers that we believe in, such that we can convince the leaders that those numbers, more than add up to our salary, much less the Davos bar bill.
So we in our business, because we are in a creative business, we were never very excited about Excel sheets and balance sheets. But now is the time when our entire team has to give creative solutions to business problems. If it is not getting or giving an outcome which is helping a business grow, any creative solution for that matter is just a nice looking creative, right? So I
100%.
take internal communication as well like that it has to align somewhere to the balance sheet of the company, somewhere it has to, though intangible, but give a measurable outcome to the company.
What we do is not intangible. Mm-hmm. We treat it as an intangible because we devalue ourselves when we treat it as intangible. What we need to do is figure out how to make it tangible, either by collecting data, asking the business for the right data. So if we want to have say we have an impact on sales, we need to get the sales data. If we can't get the sales data, then we can look at perhaps, the extent to which, customers mention that they're buying from us. But it would be nice to get the sales data. If we're looking at time to resolve customer complaints, we're saying that, if we have more clarity on what the brand means and what the promises are and what discretion our staff have to resolve problems, and we, getting data on how long it takes to resolve a problem would be great. But we also need to figure out, if we don't get that data, how can we approximate that data to say, what, if it wasn't for this, you wouldn't be getting that result. We need to get competitive in the data game. And I think once we get competitive in the data game, a lot of our confidence questions, a lot of our credibility questions will quickly go out the window.
Okay. So I guess, Mike, this 6-week expedition that you are doing across India is perhaps to understand the big shift and to get deeper inside it, to understand and to gain insights about the big shift.
Well, the big shift, as I've said, thank you for using that term. The big shift is really what I call that confluence, that interaction between the forces of automation and acceleration on the one hand, generational transformation of the workforce, and pressure on hierarchy. And one of the things that makes India interesting is that the first two issues are already very much live. AI is happening today. AI automation is happening today. AI acceleration is taking place today. You have a much more vibrant labor market. So generational change in the workplace is happening today. It's not like these companies in the West that say, we're just going to go on a 3-year hiring freeze until this all shakes out. You'd be insane to do that in India. You'd be insane to do that anywhere, but you'd be particularly insane and uncompetitive to do that here. The third leg of that is really what I want to test, which is the extent to which there is going to be pressure on hierarchy, on traditional management structures, how those will adapt. And this is an area where India is traditionally more traditional than the rest of the world.
True.
Where you've got more of a default to escalation rather than a default to action. A culture where instead of seek forgiveness, not permission, it's seek permission, not forgiveness. Now, if you're dealing in an acceleration standpoint,
Yeah.
escalation is probably will increasingly be the single biggest barrier to acceleration. So what would it take to reduce escalation? And to what extent is the culture here going to be amenable and adaptable to either empowering people to make more street level decisions, or, the extent to which that's not going to happen, and that there may be levels of hierarchy that are retained here in India that might disappear elsewhere. Now, India, as you know, has a cost advantage. So you might be able to argue that we can afford 3 layers of management in India when we can no longer afford it in Sweden or in New York City. And that's going to, if that's the case, that's going to have a whole different range of organizational implications. Right. I also floated the idea of, maybe GCCCs, global capability centers, might evolve into global management centers. I mean, there's no law that says that managers at a corporate level have to be based in Minneapolis or Munich. Yeah. They could be just as easily based in Mumbai, provided that the time zone issues could be worked out. Right. There's still a lot of room for experimentation on this. We don't know, we know that this trend is coming. We can see the storm heading in our direction. You're already getting the first showers of it. We don't quite know what the direction is going to be. We don't know quite how severe it will end up being when it hits landfall. But what we do know is that these 3 factors are very much the factors that are going to be in play when it comes to communication, when it comes to organizational change, when it comes to optimizing the workforce.
Okay. And I can't resist asking this one. So how do you think Jugaad plays a role in the big shift in India?
It's funny that you asked that, because that's the question that I'm asking every one of the people that I'm talking to. Jugaad is a term that gets very different responses from people. That, on the one hand, it's how people get around these bureaucratic and resource deficits, these bureaucratic blockages and resource deficits. And on the other hand, it's seen as a frenetic, it may get the job done once, but it may prevent the job from being done successfully 20 times further. The idea that you're taking a battery from one remote and putting it in the other, there's a certain element of box ticking to it. There's a certain element of corruption to it. There's a lot of innovation to it. What I'm looking at from a big shift perspective, and one of the things I'm looking at from an India perspective, is to what extent the Jugaad gene can be implanted into these decision-making processes without the downsides, the baggage, the inefficiencies, and the corruption involved. Some people think Jugaad means cheap and crappy. Other people think Jugaad means brilliance. What I want, and particularly initiative and brilliance. There's a need for more initiative in organizations. There's a need for more initiative of employees. There's a need for less escalation. If that side of the Jugaad gene can be injected without the other side, that's a huge win for everybody.
So, Mike, I have a question, and maybe even for a few of our curious listeners, if somebody wants to really specialize in internal communications, somebody wants to study internal communications, get certified in it, are there great courses across the globe where one can go and study?
Well, I would recommend certification at a certain level. I mean, it depends on where you are. I would not start my career and say I want to go into internal communication. In fact, very few of the successful internal comms people have come into the career with an orientation towards the career. I like to joke when, there are very few kids who grow up when they're 7-year-olds and say, I want to be an internal comms manager. One of the great weaknesses and great strengths of internal comms is the accidental nature in which most of us have come into the profession. It's great because there's a great diversity of perspectives.
Yeah.
It's terrible in that oftentimes people in the role reinvent stuff that's already been decided 20 years ago and act as if it's a great revelation. So there's some issues with that. What I would say to educate, if I was a communication practitioner, somebody in an agency like this, or somebody, in an in-house team who wanted to do internal comms,
Yeah.
I would probably do 3 or 4 things. First, I would start following top influencers in the space. Jenny Field's excellent, Rachel Miller's excellent, Joanna Parsons has a lot to say. I have a lot to say.
Exactly.
I'm, in my role as editor-in-chief of Strategic Magazine, I'm looking to surface more voices from other parts of the world. The field is way too Anglo-centric for my tastes, particularly given what I said about the momentum and energy coming from India. I'd like to see some Indian thought leaders emerge. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why I'm working with Ambij Dixit on this tour. I think he's got global potential as a thought leader in this space. And I'm sure there are going to be others who surface. So read Strategic Magazine, join IABC, join the Institute for Internal Communication. Then look at certification so that you can figure out where you stand at your current level of knowledge. Then if you want to expand your knowledge, look at adjacent fields, look at sociology, look at psychology, look at organizational behavior, look at what makes businesses tick. Yeah. I wouldn't study internal communication for the sake of studying internal communication. I would study what makes businesses tick, what makes people tick, and what makes organizations tick. And then, also look at what makes societies tick. Look at sociology, look at political science. Mm-hmm. Organizations are ultimately political animals.
Right. One last question, Mike. Though it's a very insightful conversation that we are having, I don't want to end it, but we'll have to.
It's a shame. I'd love to continue.
Sure. This is slightly different. So anything about communication, there is a communicator, right? So I maybe with respect to internal communication, I want to communicate an objective that a company needs to achieve, or we need to, as a workforce, as a team, need to reach somewhere. So there is a communicator on one side. On the other side is the listener, who, of course, has to absorb that communication in a way that he understands it, he can decipher it in his own language, and of course implement as to whatever he's learned out of that communication. What is it that the listeners should do, or what is it that listener has to possibly inculcate as a habit or a skill to be able to absorb that communication and actually implement as per that? Because I think that's when it will complete the loop. That's when it becomes an effective communication.
Well, I would turn that question on its head.
Okay.
I think the real question is, how do we as communication professionals listen to the people who are on the other side of our message so that we can adapt what we do to what their appetite and capabilities are?
Okay.
We can't tell people how you should consume this communication. We're not, the last thing we need to do is enter into a parent-child relationship with our audiences. We've got to have a more dynamic relationship with our people. And that comes from us. That comes from not just from the content we push, but the extent to which we involve them. Not just asking them to do an annual survey to rate things on a scale of 1 to 10. It's more like, asking open-ended questions. Always asking, when you're doing a survey, what are the top 3 priorities in the company? What are the top 3 things you're working on? And being able to say, okay, there is a gap. There is something missing. There is something that's misaligned. And then working to close that gap, working to make our communication more relevant and resonant, not just for the sake of the listener, but for the sake of the listener being able to participate constructively in our common goal of achieving organizational objectives.
Right. Great. I think we can kind of end this conversation and take it off camera perhaps. But thank you so much, Mike, for this enriching conversation that I've just had, and of course for our listeners as well. The importance of internal communication, I guess, is not yet understood the way it should be. But like you mentioned, that it'll soon become a core function.
It will either soon become a core function or organizations will cease functioning.
True. Great. Thank you so much.
You're
I can
welcome.
only thank you a lot for this time that you've given, for the conversation, and for the insights that you've kind of given us about communication as a whole and internal communication as a crucial part of an organization.
Well, I want to thank you for your excellent questions, and I want to thank
Glad.
you and Seagull for giving me this platform to share this conversation and spread it more broadly.
I'm glad. Thank you so much. So that was Mike Klein. The point to note is that internal communication practitioners might soon take a seat at the executive table, and it's not very far. But until then, communicate strategically. Thank you.
Here's to ideas.